Okay, let's look at the first little italicized paragraph in Hopeful Monsters. Goldsmith did not object to general microevolutionary principles. However, he veered from the synthetic theory in his belief that a new species develops suddenly through discontinuous variation or macromutation. He agreed that most macromutations ended disastrously with what he called monsters. Nonetheless, Goldschmidt believed that a small percentage of macromutations could, with chance and luck, equip an organism with radically beneficial adaptive traits with which to survive and prosper. These he called hopeful monsters. It's like, what's the difference between continuous and discontinuous? This expresses a subjective point of view, you know. What do you notice as discontinuous? When does something jump into the foreground rather than just being part of the background? What's a sudden discontinuous veering from the continuous background of change? That's a subjective selection. It's a subjective noticing. I choose to notice that. And that's what this story is about, right? Noticing. What gets noticed is different. And of course, monsters, let's see, you know, put in quotation marks. Scare quote. It's an interesting body language, figurative language there. He's saying monsters, you know, I don't really mean monsters, but I kind of do. So I'm using it, but in quotation marks as a kind of alibi to say I'm saying it, but not saying it. That's a gesture, finessing this awkward lack of place in language. And these other terms are likewise ambiguously subjective. Chance, luck, beneficial adaptation, to prosper and survive. I mean, survive is objective, but all these other terms are evaluative. So it's sort of indicating, again, precisely what the story is about, that survival depends on affirmation, you know, subjective affirmation, is choosing to notice it, but also to evaluate it positively as beneficial, adaptive, in service of prosperity. It's a chance and luck. What gets called good luck versus bad luck? These are, subjective evaluations that are getting disguised as if they were technical terms like macromutation, microevolution, and synthesis, and so on. And it also hints at money, like Frankenstein. You know, Frankenstein means currency, you know, like a franc, like a stamp, gold likewise. Currency is a way of mediating between the concrete particular and some kind of supposedly totally abstract measure of value. So we can see Goldschmidt performing this translation here. And that's what the story does, you know, explores the possibility of this translation, the horrific body, into some term of cultural recognition as social belonging. You know, like the book, the lesbian couple has the book of names. Do you belong in the book? That's a question. Do you belong in the story? You know, not just this story, but like the human story. So let's look at another passage. This is just like 3 pages in to Hopeful Monsters. He's reacting to Dr. Armstrong. Another sort of proper name like Goldschmidt or Frankenstein that doesn't actually represent a person so much as like this abstract scientific authority or just patriarchal authority. The subjective authority precisely not to be subjective, but to be objective and to just tell you how things are. I want you to think about how this narration here responds to or replaces Dr. Armstrong's banal reassurances. What is there to worry about? You're about to embark on the most natural journey of life. Commonplace miracle, ha ha ha. This voice of authority and knowledge trying to reassure her in very banal terms that even he himself is laughing at. It's sort of like Goldschmidt putting monsters in quotation marks. It's like he doesn't even believe himself. So think about again, how this narrative here responds. How does this narrative represent Hisa's experience? She closed her eyes again. Dr. Armstrong was Bobby's doctor. She kept her eyes shut through the last of his commentary and reopened them only after his shoes squeaked through the door. It's very physical. The narrator doesn't tell us that she wasn't listening or trying not to hear Dr. Armstrong's words, but she tells us what she's doing with her body. She kept her eyes shut. It's as if, but we can understand, we can make the connection that this physical gesture of keeping her eyes shut was a way of trying to keep his words out. So keeping his words out it's like keeping his body out. She can only reopen her eyes once his body is out the door, and that's signaled by the squeaking sound. It's really a physical negotiating this doctor's perspective on her body, on her physical experience. What is her perspective on her body? Hisa stared at the bulge that rose magnificently from her midriff. The baby churned, digging a knee or elbow. She could see the skin give, as if an alien was trying to burst out of her belly even while she watched, alive and horrified. Well, she's having quite an intense, overwhelming physical experience. Not just being in her body, but being precisely alienated from her body. The pain, the discomfort of being in her own skin. But the definition of body horror. And she refers to the classic of body horror, Ridley Scott's 1979 movie Alien, and thereby, I think, signals the importance not just of language, but of cultural media in general, in terms as representing the body, transmitting bodily experiences, codifying bodily experiences, figuring embodied experience for one another. This gets, like the mother says about bad thoughts traveling down the umbilical tube to the baby. Our language, our cultural media transmit as if through umbilical tubes feelings, embodied feelings, what it is to be embodied, what a body is. So it's getting, what we're learning through the narrative here is that Hisa learned to be horrified from the Ridley Scott movie. Ridley Scott had a lot to answer for. And it's interesting, she immediately starts thinking about the law. Like, did he get sued for that? That horror is something that is illegal, that the law tries to regulate its effects. Americans she knew sued over things like spilled coffee and music videos with homosexual male police officers. So she's talking about, again, like the umbilical cord, media, culture, transmit bodily effects. They burn us, like unless the eye catch fire. They sexually confuse us or offend us or infect us. The relationship of the law to the untamable body, instilling us with pain or desires. And she thinks of other doctor authorities that she has learned about through culture, through TV, and makes a category mistake. No, he was a coroner. Yeah, those weren't servants of health, but servants of death. Here's the famous eruption in Alien, the alien creature coming out. The man gives birth. There's an interesting, number of category binaries are blurred, troubled in this scene. It's a scene of dinner. They're all sitting around eating. So who's consuming who? Are you being consumed, or are you the consumer? Obviously, male and female giving birth to this. It's a kind of birth scene, but it's a very phallic alien that erupts out of this man. There's a very clear racial subtext, gender, race, us, them, animal, human. So what I'm suggesting is, like the film Alien, these stories all in different ways are drawing our attention, using language indirectly to draw our attention to what's taboo, what goes unsaid. These texts are helping us to recognize and communicate what goes unsaid. Like cinema, I think they can be compared to kinds of technology. They're manipulating language to bend these foundational boundaries between the objective and subjective, the concrete and abstract. Make us question what it means to prosper, what it means to survive, what it means to be lucky, and what it means to have a home, what it means to have a family, to belong to a family. These are all these basic boundaries getting negotiated in really profound ways in these stories. They're so powerful. This book, written by the UBC faculty member Mandy Lynn-Controne, How to Fall in Love with Anyone, is a fascinating story of this psychological experiment that was done in the 50s to see if love could be induced in laboratory settings. And they found out it could be. People are just invited to go through together. Given the choice of anyone in the world, whom would you want as a dinner guest? Would you like to be famous? In what way? Before making a telephone call, do you ever rehearse what you're going to say? Why? What would constitute a perfect day for you? So this is a formula for behavior. Go through these motions and you will fall in love. Have this conversation. It's pretty amazing. And I think it's an interesting comparison to think of what we're doing when we're reading these texts. One final feature of this formula that's really interesting The participants are asked to look in each other's eyes for 4 minutes or something straight, silently, just looking at each other. And it's kind of like a mutual imprinting. But I think, acknowledgement of the specificity of the other, whatever that, radical singularity is that's you, even beyond your name. It's like my concern for you as a living, changing, creature gets crystallized in that kind of experience of just paying attention to you for 4 minutes. I mean, isn't it crazy that you put a number on that? Like, yeah, 4 minutes will do. But that's sort of what these short stories are, isn't it? It's like sit down, spend some time in this other world, in this other body, and you're changed by it. It's like watching a movie. You're troubled, enriched. Your world, the variety of material, sensuous experience, what you acknowledge as possible human experience, as possible part of your world, is enriched through things like movies, or peopled, and what populated, as they say, I think in scientific experiments, it's like populate the field with the data. Your world of concepts, of possible stories, is getting populated with actual people, actual experiences that you're giving really focused attention to when you read a story or watch a movie. And so the point is, we can really rewire ourselves and our categories of us and them, self and other. It makes these Frankenstein stories of constructing new human, like Goldschmidt at the beginning of Hopeful Monsters. They actually do that. Like, literature actually does that. It performs, I think that's one way of reading the story, it performs that macro evolution. Now I belong. I recognize what was a monster. I'm part of it. I recognize the possibility of that hope of a monster, or that prosperity, a monster's prosperity. I've become a part of that through the process of reading the story. I think that's a powerful way of thinking about what is at stake when we empathize with characters and imaginary characters and stories. We've been talking a lot in this class in different ways about metamorphosis. If only by reading about changing yourself, and changing your conception of the world you belong to, whether, family or society, the social systems you participate in and thereby perpetuate. So thinking about yourself not just as an identity isolated, but thinking about yourself in terms of the systems of social reproduction that you participate in. This is, Nietzsche describes a sort of fable of history in terms of metamorphosis. The camel, we become a camel at first through our capacity to bear burdens, fulfill our duties. So the next stage of metamorphosis is a lion, this apex predator who decides for itself what to do, takes dictation from no one, takes orders from no one. So even beyond the lion, the next stage, the ultimate metamorphosis, is the human child. What can the child do which even the lion could not do? Why hath the preying lion still to become a child? Innocence is the child, and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a holy yea, holy yes. Inventing new purposes, new values, a wheel rolling out of itself. We create our own histories. We decide what we assert ourselves for. It's not just asserting superior power, it's changing what power even means in the first place. That's the innocence, the radical creativity of the child's innocent playfulness. This is what Butler is most interested in, is creating our own history, um, creating ourselves by creating our own history, the wheel rolling out of oneself as a reproductive system of oneself. What I am is about asserting a certain set of reproductive values. I see this right from the beginning of Bloodchild. The distribution of the eggs among the family, explaining the event with which the story opens, is a matter of understanding a whole complex and rather deeply disturbing system of reproduction. There are a lot of images in the story of violence that we're asked to read as images of love. Think of Dugoi licking the blood away from Lomas. Dugoi seemed to pay no attention as she lengthened and deepened the cut, now and then pausing to lick away blood. His blood vessels contracted, reacting to the chemistry of her saliva, and the bleeding slowed. It's an odd sentence there, because it's like, from whose perspective is this getting reported? Presumably the narrator can't see the blood vessels contracting. This sounds like a piece of information that the narrator has learned in the course of his education. The diagrams and drawings that Tagore had shown me, I knew how it worked. It had been explained to me all my life. Making the blood vessels contract by licking away the blood is a systemic feature of reproduction that the narrator Gon has been instructed about, presumably told, why it's good, the same way in which we might be told the birds and the bees as kids were instructed in why it makes sense and why it's good and wholesome and purposeful and so on. But evidently here he's not able to internalize it. His whole being revolts at the spectacle of this so-called birth. He doesn't know why he hasn't vomited. He feels like he's participating in a torture. And it's also interesting features of this system of reproduction. We learned this idea of the preserve, that humans exist in this preserve, and Gatoy is sort of a representative of the government, preserving the humans from to click off the preserve. It's because they're on the preserve that Kui has insight before Gon in this scene. Kui was already familiar with the violence of the T'Klik and tried to run away. And he realizes the preserve is actually not just a preserve, but also a cage. So this is, as Octavia Butler says, this is a coming of age story in a certain way, and all coming of age stories have to do with recognizing hard realities that we're shielded from in childhood, right? Recognizing, the scary realities of death and sexuality and the, cruel, indifferent randomness of the world. So that's what Gon is waking up to hear as well. Because don't we too rely on promises of fidelity, promises of family. Just like here, the story ends with, I'll always take care of you. I do consider you family. What does that mean, though? That's just a promise. Family is nothing more than the faith that we bring to family. And, we've seen this in so many different examples. The narrator ends up volunteering to experience the horror that he couldn't bear witnessing. Don't do it to my sister, do it to me. Because, Gon seems to reason, it would be easier to know that red worms were growing in my flesh instead of hers. So, once again, as in Frankenstein, horror becomes the test of intimacy, of bonding. We bonding over the prospect of horror. That's what really holds us together. And Gon, in a way, that turns the tables a little bit on Gatoy, insisting on maintaining the rifle. If we're not your animals, if we are family, and if we're talking about these adult realities of family, then you have to accept the risk too. There is risk, Gatoy, in dealing with any partner. I think that's a fascinating idea here in this story, which, like Frankenstein, it's horrific, but finally it's about you. It's about the horror that the story forces you to feel, that tells you about yourself. It's an interesting line here. Rather ironic use of the term grace to describe something not graceful at all. It's an interesting sort of refinement of the horror, this incipient horror. It's not there yet, but that kind of makes it all the more horrifying. Butler is very precise about describing the horror, the horrific object. It was worse than finding something dead, rotting, and filled with tiny animal grubs, and it was far worse than any drawing or diagram. So it's a specific horror of infested live flesh, not infested dead flesh. And she's specific about the horror insofar as she's saying, this is what the drawing or diagram left out. I'd been told about this all my life, but this is what the analytical explanations left out. Is interesting to think about, okay, so what's different from the diagram drawn by this text? I mean, this text is, what we're getting here is a codified schematization of some kind. That's what text is. Butler's bringing up the question of, again, diagramming, codifying, and what it leaves out. How is it that she's able to bring it back in? And this line makes me think of pregnancy. It makes me think of morning sickness in relationship to birth. Sort of an illness that serves also as a kind of preparation of the body for transformation.